You should not be here. This family pew is not for you.
He told his ex-wife she did not belong in the church. Then the priest stopped the service. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. If someone told you that you no longer belonged in a place you once called home, would you stay or walk away? Now let's begin. You are not family anymore. You do not belong here. Everett Sloan said it quietly, but the white stone walls carried every word farther than he intended. The organ continued beneath him for half a measure, then faltered. Noelle Whitaker sat in the front family pew with an aged cream envelope resting across her navy dress, her back straight, her chin level, and her eyes fixed on the framed photograph beside the altar. Margaret Sloan smiled from beneath a wreath of white lilies, silver hair softly curled, the same patient expression she had worn the last time Noelle saw her alive. The church was full that Sunday morning. Sunlight poured through tall windows and scattered pale colors across the polished aisle. Men adjusted dark ties. Women held folded memorial programs in their laps. Somewhere behind Noelle, a child whispered and was gently quieted. Everett stood beside the pew in a charcoal suit, one hand resting against its carved wooden end as though he owned not only the seat, but the right to decide who could grieve there. His fiancée, Daphne Cross, waited several feet away near the aisle, dressed in soft gray, her expression carefully neutral. This row is for family, Everett added. You should find another seat. Noelle looked down at the envelope. Margaret's handwriting curved across the front in faded blue ink. For Noelle, open only when everyone is present. She had read those words so many times during the past 3 days that she could see them even with her eyes closed. She had almost stayed home. It would have been easier to mourn Margaret alone, far from the church where she had once married Everett, far from the people who had watched their life together become polished on the outside and hollow underneath. But Margaret had asked her to come, not through an attorney, not through Father Rowan, through a letter delivered by hand the morning after her death. Noelle placed one palm over the envelope and remained seated. Everett's mouth tightened. He had expected tears, an apology, perhaps a quiet retreat down the aisle while the congregation pretended not to notice. Her stillness unsettled him more than any argument could have. Near the altar, Father Rowan Hale lifted his eyes from the open memorial book. He was a tall man in his late 50s with silver at his temples and a voice that rarely needed volume. He looked first at Everett, then at Noelle, then at the photograph of Margaret between them. Jonah Bell, seated at the organ, saw the priest's expression and slowly removed his hands from the keys. The final chord thinned into silence. Heads turned. Everett glanced toward the altar, irritation flashing across his face. Father, this is a private family matter. Father Rowan closed the book. The sound was soft, but in the sudden quiet it seemed to travel through every pew. Not anymore, he said. Noelle finally looked up. Father Rowan stepped away from the lectern and faced the congregation. We will not begin a service of remembrance, he said, by telling someone Margaret invited that she has no place here. Everett's confidence shifted for the first time. His hand left the pew. His eyes moved to the envelope on Noelle's lap. He had not noticed it before. Now he could not look away. She invited you, he asked. Noelle held his gaze, calm and unreadable. She asked me to bring something, she said. Father Rowan looked at the sealed envelope. Did she tell you when to open it? Noelle turned it over once in her hands. The paper made a faint, dry sound against her ring. Around her, the church waited. When everyone was here, she answered. Everett's face changed, and Noelle understood that whatever he feared was not written on the outside. It was the possibility that his mother had chosen to speak after he could no longer stop her. Noelle did not open the envelope immediately. She looked toward Margaret's photograph, and the stillness of the church carried her back to the first winter after the divorce, when Everett had made it clear that every connection between her and the Sloan family was expected to end with the marriage. He changed the locks on the lake house, removed her name from the family charity board, and told relatives that she wanted a clean break. Noelle had corrected no one. By then, she had learned how quickly truth could sound like pleading when spoken to people who had already chosen a convenient version. Margaret was the only one who refused to disappear. Her first call came on a Tuesday evening in January. Noelle had been closing the small senior care center where she worked when her phone lit up with a number she still knew by memory. Margaret did not apologize for calling. She asked whether Noelle still made the chicken soup with lemon and rice. 2 hours later, Noelle stood outside Margaret's townhouse with a covered container warming her hands. That visit became another, then another. Margaret's health had begun to fail quietly. There were cardiology appointments, medication changes, and long afternoons when she did not need assistance so much as company. Everett paid for private nursing care, grocery delivery, and a driver, but his visits often lasted less than 20 minutes. He arrived with expensive flowers, checked his watch, and left before the tea cooled. Noelle never criticized him. Margaret never defended him. They spoke instead about ordinary things: old hymns, recipes, neighbors, and the stubborn rosebush beneath Margaret's kitchen window. Some nights, Margaret asked Noelle to read aloud because her eyes tired easily. Other nights, they sat without speaking while rain moved against the glass. "Do not tell Everett I called," Margaret once said. "He thinks forgiveness is something people owe him before he changes." Noelle had looked across the room at the framed wedding photograph still resting on Margaret's shelf. "I am not hiding from him," she replied. "I know," Margaret said. "You are protecting me from having to choose." The truth was more painful. Margaret had already chosen silence many times during the marriage. She had witnessed Everett dismiss Noelle at family dinners, take credit for her work at charity events, and speak over her whenever she challenged him. Margaret had been kind afterward, but kindness in private had never stopped the humiliation in public. Near the end, she admitted that. "I thought keeping peace meant staying quiet," she told Noelle one evening. It only taught him that no one would interrupt him. Back in the church, Noelle felt the sealed paper beneath her fingertips. Father Rowan waited near the altar without urging her. Everett did not. "Whatever is in there should have been given to the family," he said. His voice was lower now, but the congregation could still hear him. Daphne turned toward him with a faint crease between her brows. "She was family to your mother," she said. Everett looked at her as if she had broken an agreement. Noelle noticed the reaction but kept her attention on the envelope. She slipped one finger beneath the old seal, then stopped when she saw a second line of handwriting along the back flap. "Please let Father Rowan read this aloud." Her breath caught, not from fear, but from recognition. Margaret had known Noelle might be accused of changing the words, exaggerating them, or making the moment about herself. Even now, she had protected her from carrying the truth alone. Noelle rose from the pew and walked toward the altar. The congregation followed her with their eyes. She placed the unopened envelope in Father Rowan's hands. Everett stepped into the aisle. "Father, I am asking you not to do this." Father Rowan studied him for a moment. "You asked this church to remember your mother," he said. "We will let her speak." He opened the envelope carefully. Inside were two folded letters. One was addressed to the congregation. The other carried Everett's name. Father Rowan unfolded the letter addressed to the congregation and held it beneath the warm light from the tall windows. The paper trembled once between his fingers, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of reading a dead woman's words aloud in front of the people who had known only the version of her life presented from a podium. "My friends," he began, and the familiar shape of Margaret's voice seemed to settle over the room. "If this letter is being read, then I am no longer able to correct the silence I helped create." Noelle remained beside the altar, her hands loosely folded at her waist. Everett stood in the aisle without moving. The color had begun to leave his face. Father Rowan continued. Margaret wrote that she had spent years believing peace meant avoiding conflict, especially when the conflict involved her only son. She admitted she had watched Everett speak over Noelle, diminish her contributions, and allow others to believe the marriage had failed because Noelle lacked loyalty. Margaret had offered comfort afterward, behind closed doors, but she had rarely challenged him where anyone could hear. "Private kindness," Father Rowan read, "does not repair public harm." A soft breath moved through the pews. Daphne lowered her eyes. Several longtime members of the congregation exchanged uneasy glances, remembering charity dinners where Everett had accepted praise for programs Noelle had organized, and Sunday mornings when Noelle had quietly carried boxes downstairs while he stood near the entrance greeting donors. Margaret's letter did not accuse the church. It asked the church to examine how easily money, confidence, and a respected last name could be mistaken for character. Then Father Rowan reached the part that changed the room. Margaret explained that during the final year of her life, Noelle had driven her to medical appointments, prepared meals, organized medication, and sat beside her through nights when sleep would not come. She had done it without payment, recognition, or any promise of reconciliation with Everett. My son provided for my care, Margaret had written. Noelle gave me her presence. I am grateful for both, but only one of them kept me from feeling alone. Everett looked at Noelle then, but she did not return his gaze. She watched Father Rowan, listening to words Margaret had never spoken so plainly while alive. The letter went on to say that Noelle had asked for nothing in return. She had not requested a place in the family pew, a mention in the memorial program, or any share of Margaret's estate. Her only request had been that Margaret tell the truth while there was still time. Margaret had failed to do it in person. The letter was her final attempt. Father Rowan paused before the closing lines. Outside, sunlight shifted across the pale floor, turning the edge of Noelle's navy dress gold for a moment. If Noelle is present today, he read, it is because I asked her to come. If anyone tells her she does not belong, they are speaking against my final wish, not protecting it. The silence that followed was different from the one Everett had created. That silence did not isolate Noelle. It surrounded her. Father Rowan folded the letter carefully and placed it on the lectern. Everett's voice came out strained. My mother was ill. She was emotional. This should never have been made public. Miriam Cole rose from the third pew. At 62, she had managed church records for nearly 3 decades and rarely spoke during services. Margaret gave me a copy 2 weeks ago, she said. She was clear about what she wanted. Everett turned toward her. You knew? Miriam nodded. She wanted to be certain the letter could not disappear. The words landed quietly, but Everett reacted as though a locked door had opened behind him. Father Rowan picked up the second letter, the one bearing Everett's name. He did not unfold it. Instead, he stepped down from the altar and held it out. This one is not for the congregation, he said. Everett stared at the envelope without taking it. Noelle finally looked at him. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only a calm sadness that made his defensiveness seem smaller. Your mother did not leave this to embarrass you, she said. She left it because she still believed you could listen. Everett accepted the letter, but before he could break the seal, Father Rowan spoke again. There is something else we must address first. His eyes moved toward the memorial program, where Everett's name appeared beneath the words principal donor. Because your mother's letter is not the only reason this service was stopped. Father Rowan turned toward the front pews, where the memorial programs rested in careful rows beside white roses and folded tissues. This service was also stopped, he said, because sacred space cannot be used to purchase control over another person. Everett's eyes narrowed. The second letter remained unopened in his hand. What exactly are you accusing me of? He asked. Father Rowan did not raise his voice. I am asking you to listen. Miriam stepped into the aisle carrying a slim blue folder from the church office. She placed it on the lectern and opened it to a series of donation agreements, meeting notes, and correspondence from the previous 6 months. The church roof had needed urgent repairs before winter. Everett had pledged a large contribution and presented it publicly as a gift made in Margaret's honor. The congregation had thanked him. His name appeared in the bulletin, on the renovation committee, and beneath the architectural drawings displayed in the fellowship hall. What most people had not seen were the conditions attached to the final payment. Everett had requested control over the memorial service, approval of all speakers, authority to determine the family seating, and the right to remove any guest he considered disruptive. He had never written Noelle's name, but the intention was now impossible to miss. Daphne looked at him slowly. You made her exclusion part of the donation? Everett shook his head. That is not what the agreement says. Miriam turned one page. It says the donor retains final approval over all participants connected to the Sloan family. Because I was protecting my mother's dignity, he replied. Father Rowan looked toward Margaret's photograph. Her dignity did not require Noelle's absence. Everett's grip tightened around the unopened letter. You accepted the money. The finance committee accepted a pledge, Father Rowan said. We did not accept ownership. The difference settled heavily across the church. Noelle stood near the altar, listening as the structure Everett had built around the mourning began to collapse without anyone attacking him. He had not shouted. He had not threatened. He had simply used paperwork, money, and social authority to arrange a room where Noelle could be erased without appearing to be expelled. It was the same method he had used during their marriage. He rarely demanded silence directly. He created conditions in which speaking became costly, embarrassing, or disloyal. Noelle remembered a charity banquet 8 years earlier when she had written the entire outreach proposal, and Everett accepted the award alone because, as he explained afterward, donors preferred a single public face. She remembered suggesting a shelter partnership only to hear him present the same idea at the next board meeting without mentioning her. Each time, he offered a practical reason. Each time, her absence became easier for others to overlook. After the divorce, Noelle chose work where no one needed a stage. At the senior care center, she spent mornings helping families compare home care options and afternoons sitting with residents whose children lived across the country. She learned to measure a day differently. A completed insurance form mattered. A returned phone call mattered. Sitting quietly beside someone who feared being forgotten mattered. Margaret had understood that kind of presence because she had needed it. Everett still measured care by what could be announced. "The roof will not repair itself," he said, glancing toward the congregation. "If you reject my contribution, you are risking this entire church over a private disagreement." Several people shifted uneasily. The threat was not dramatic, but it was real. Winter storms had already damaged one corner of the sanctuary. Without the remaining funds, repairs would be delayed. Father Rowan looked toward the pale ceiling, then back at Everett. "A roof protects a building," he said. "It does not excuse what happens beneath it." Everett gave a humorless smile. "Principles are easy when someone else pays for them." Noelle finally stepped forward. "Then do not reject the donation because of me," she said. Every face turned toward her. "Finish the service. Let the repairs continue. I will sit somewhere else." Everett's expression softened with the relief of a man who believed the old pattern had returned. Father Rowan's did not. "Noelle," he said gently, "peace that requires the injured person to disappear is not peace." Miriam closed the blue folder. Daphne moved away from Everett and sat alone at the end of a pew. Father Rowan faced the congregation. "The service will continue," he said, "but not under conditions that give one donor authority over another person's belonging." Then he looked directly at Everett. "Until the council reviews these agreements, your leadership role is suspended." Everett stared at him in disbelief. The unopened letter from Margaret remained in his hand, suddenly heavier than the donation he had used to control the room. Everett looked from Father Rowan to Miriam, waiting for someone to soften the decision. No one did. The church remained still, but the balance inside it had changed. Until that moment, Everett had believed his donation made him indispensable. Now the very people who had thanked him were watching to see whether he understood that generosity, without humility, could become another form of control. "You cannot suspend me in the middle of my mother's service," he said. Father Rowan answered with the same calm tone. "Your mother's service is precisely why we must." Everett glanced toward the open aisle, then toward the congregation. Several faces he knew well had lowered their eyes. Others met his gaze without hostility, but without the automatic approval he was accustomed to receiving. Noelle remained near the altar. She did not look pleased. She looked tired, as though she had seen this moment coming long before anyone else recognized the pattern. Everett held up Margaret's sealed letter. "And what am I supposed to do with this?" he asked. Noelle looked at the envelope. "Read it." His expression hardened. "In front of everyone?" "No," she said. "It is yours." The answer unsettled him more than public exposure would have. If Noelle had wanted revenge, she could have demanded that Father Rowan read the letter aloud. She could have used Margaret's final words to finish what the first letter had begun. Instead, she gave him privacy. That small mercy left him without a villain to blame. Father Rowan stepped back toward the lectern. "You may stay for the service," he said, "but you will sit as a grieving son, not as the person directing this congregation." Everett looked toward the front family pew. The seat beside Margaret's photograph had been prepared for him. For the first time, it did not look like a place of honor. It looked like a place where he would have to listen. Daphne remained at the far end of another pew, her hands folded over the memorial program. She did not move to join him. Everett walked slowly to the front and sat alone. The second letter remained unopened across his knees. Jonah returned his hands to the organ keys, but Father Rowan raised one finger, asking him to wait. "Before we continue," he said, "there is one more truth that should not be hidden." Miriam opened the blue folder again and removed a thinner set of records. Noelle recognized the pages immediately. They belonged to the Church Care Fund, a program she had helped create 12 years earlier after a widow named Elaine Porter nearly lost her apartment while caring for her sick husband. The fund had started with grocery cards, rent assistance, and volunteer rides to medical appointments. Everett had later renamed the annual campaign and presented it as part of the Sloan family legacy. Noelle had allowed it because the program kept helping people. She had never asked for public credit. Miriam explained that after the divorce, anonymous deposits continued arriving every month. Some were small. Others covered emergency rent, utility bills, or funeral meals. The source had been hidden at Noelle's request. She did not want recipients turned into examples for fundraising, Miriam said. Elaine rose from a pew near the center. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. When my husband died, Noelle sat with me at the kitchen table until I could understand the paperwork. She never mentioned her name being removed from anything. Another woman stood. Then an older man. One by one, people described rides, meals, phone calls, and quiet help that had never appeared in a church bulletin. Noelle lowered her eyes. This was not the recognition she had sought. She had wanted the work to remain private because hardship was private. Father Rowan looked toward Everett. This church was not sustained by one large gift, he said. It was sustained by many acts of presence. Everett stared at the letter in his lap. Slowly, he broke the seal. His eyes moved across the first lines, and the certainty in his face began to disappear. Noelle could not see the words, but she knew Margaret's voice. She knew it would not condemn him. Margaret had loved her son too much to flatter him any longer. Everett read in silence, then stopped halfway down the page. His hand trembled slightly against the paper. At last, he looked toward Noelle. She said you asked her to forgive me, he whispered. Noelle held his gaze. I asked her not to leave this world carrying anger. Everett looked back at the letter. Beneath the shame in his expression was something quieter and less familiar. The first sign that he understood forgiveness had never meant freedom from consequence. Everett lowered the letter, but his eyes remained fixed on the final paragraph. Margaret had written that love was not proven by protecting someone from discomfort. It was proven by asking them to become better when remaining unchanged would be easier. She told him that Noelle had never asked her to choose sides, never repeated the private details of their marriage, and never used Margaret's illness as a path back into the Sloan family. She had simply shown up. You have spent years believing that providing is the same as being present, Margaret wrote. Money can repair a roof, hire a nurse, and print your name in a program. It cannot sit beside someone who is afraid. It cannot apologize. It cannot listen. Everett folded the page once, then opened it again, as if the words might change if he gave them another chance. They did not. Father Rowan waited near the lectern. The congregation remained quiet, no longer watching for punishment, but for a decision. Noelle understood that difference. Public shame would have been easy. Accountability was harder because it required Everett to act after everyone went home. He rose from the pew slowly. For a moment, Noelle thought he might leave. Instead, he walked toward the aisle and stopped several feet from her. His voice was low. Did she know about the donation agreement? She knew you wanted to control the service, Noelle said. She did not know how far you had taken it. Everett looked toward Miriam's blue folder. I thought I was protecting her memory. You were protecting the version of it. That kept you in charge. The words were calm, without accusation in their tone, which made them harder to dismiss. Daphne watched from the side pew, her expression no longer guarded. You told me Noelle abandoned your mother, she said. Everett turned toward her. I believed she had. You never asked, Daphne replied. Everett looked back at the letter in his hands. The answer was there, not only in Margaret's handwriting, but in every empty chair beside her during the final months he had been too busy to notice. Father Rowan stepped forward. The council will review your leadership position and the conditions attached to your contribution, he said. Until that review is complete, you will not direct services, approve speakers, or represent this church publicly. Everett's face tightened. And if I withdraw the money? A murmur moved through the pews, then faded. Father Rowan looked toward the damaged ceiling above the south transept. Then we will repair the roof more slowly. You would risk the building? Everett asked. I would rather ask this congregation for help than teach them that belonging can be purchased. Miriam closed the folder. Elaine Porter stood again. I will contribute what I can, she said. A man behind her raised his hand. So will I. Another voice followed, then another. No one promised a fortune. They offered $50, $200, a weekend of carpentry, access to discounted materials, help organizing a community fundraiser. The amounts were smaller than Everett's pledge, but the willingness behind them filled the room in a way his check never had. Noel watched Everett hear the church discover it could continue without his control. He did not look angry anymore. He looked unnecessary, and that realization seemed to frighten him more. He turned to Noel. What do you want me to do? It was the first question he had asked her that morning without already deciding the answer. Noel glanced at Margaret's photograph. Read the rest of your mother's letter, she said. Then decide whether you came here to honor her or to be honored by everyone else. Everett looked down at the page. Near the bottom, Margaret had written one. Final request, sit through the service. Listen without defending yourself. When it ends, apologize without asking to be forgiven immediately. Everett returned to the front pew, but he did not take the center seat. He sat at the far end, away from the place he had reserved as a symbol of authority. Father Rowan opened the memorial book again. Jonah placed his hands on the organ keys. Before the first chord sounded, an elderly woman beside Noel shifted toward the aisle and opened a place next to her. Noel sat down quietly. Across the church, Everett unfolded his mother's letter for the third time, and this time, he began reading from the beginning. The organ began again, softer this time, and the service moved forward without Everett directing a single word of it. Father Rowan spoke about Margaret's patience, her sharp memory for birthdays, and the way she carried peppermints in her purse for children who became restless during long Sunday mornings. The congregation smiled when Jonah described how she corrected the choir from the third pew without ever admitting she had missed a note herself. Noel listened with her hands folded over the empty place where the envelope had rested. For several minutes, the church remembered Margaret as more than Everett's mother, more than a donor's name, more than the center of a public dispute. She became a woman again. Across the aisle, Everett sat at the end of the front pew, reading the same lines until the paper softened beneath his fingers. When Father Rowan invited anyone with a memory to speak, Elaine Porter rose first. She told a simple story about Margaret bringing groceries during a February storm and staying long enough to drink a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Then Miriam spoke about Margaret's habit of leaving handwritten thank you notes in the church office. Noel did not stand. She had no desire to turn grief into evidence. She kept her memories where Margaret had trusted her to keep them. Everett watched her remain seated. That silence seemed to trouble him. He had built his entire defense on the belief that she had come to claim attention, yet she accepted none when it was freely offered. Near the end of the service, Father Rowan closed the memorial book and asked the congregation to remain seated for a final moment of reflection. Everett stood before the silence had settled. Every face turned toward him. He buttoned his jacket, glanced once at Daphne, and stepped into the center aisle. The old confidence returned to his posture, polished by years of business dinners, council meetings, and rooms where people waited for him to decide what mattered. I would like to say something, he announced. Father Rowan did not invite him forward, but he did not stop him. Everett turned toward the congregation. This morning has become unnecessarily complicated, he said. My mother deserved dignity, and I made decisions I believed would protect that. Noel looked at him. He had begun exactly as Margaret warned he would, explaining intention before acknowledging harm. The roof pledge remains available, he continued, provided the council handles this privately and restores proper order. A few people shifted in their seats. The offer sounded generous until the condition reached them. Daphne's expression hardened. Miriam stood beside the lectern, motionless. Everett looked toward Noel at last. And since you clearly want a place here, I am willing to let this go. Noel rose slowly. She did not move into the aisle. You are willing to let what go? She asked. His jaw tightened. The disruption. The misunderstanding. All of it. You told me I did not belong at the memorial of a woman who asked me to come. Her voice remained quiet. That was not a misunderstanding. Everett glanced toward the congregation, aware that every pause now belonged to someone else. I was grieving. So was I. The words were not sharp, but they left him nowhere to hide. He lifted the donation letter from the pew beside him. Do you understand what is at stake? Without this funding, repairs could take a year. Noel's eyes moved briefly toward the damaged ceiling, then back to him. Then let them take a year. A faint breath passed through the church. Everett stared at her. He had expected gratitude, fear, or at least hesitation. Instead, she stood beneath the stained glass light with no title, no committee seat, and no money offered as leverage. Yet she seemed to possess the only authority in the room that could not be purchased. "You would rather watch this place struggle?" he asked. "I would rather help rebuild it honestly." Elaine rose beside her. "So would I." Then Jonah stood near the organ. Miriam followed. One by one, people came to their feet, not against Everett, but beside the principle he had tried to price. No applause followed. No one humiliated him. Their quiet agreement was worse than anger because it could not be dismissed as emotion. Father Rowan stepped down from the altar. "Everett," he said, "you may remain for the closing prayer, but you may not attach conditions to this congregation's conscience." Everett looked around the church and finally understood that the room he once controlled had stopped waiting for his permission. He reached for the second letter from his mother, unfolded it once more, and found a final line written beneath her signature, a line he had missed until then. His eyes stopped moving. Then he looked at Noelle as if Margaret had revealed something he had spent years refusing to see. The final line beneath Margaret's signature was written smaller than the rest, as though she had added it after sitting with the letter for a long time. "The person you keep trying to remove is the person who protected your place in my heart when I was too disappointed to speak your name kindly." Everett read it twice. The church remained standing around him, but the room seemed to narrow until there was only the page, Noelle, and the truth he had spent years arranging his life to avoid. He looked toward her with an expression stripped of performance. "You defended me?" he asked. Noelle did not answer immediately. Sunlight moved across the aisle between them, touching the edge of Margaret's photograph and the folded memorial program in Everett's hand. "She was angry with you," Noelle said. "She had reasons to be. And you asked her not to be?" "I asked her not to let disappointment become the last thing she carried." Everett lowered his eyes. "Why?" Noelle's voice stayed even. "Because loving someone does not always mean inviting them back into your life. Sometimes it means refusing to make their worst choices the only truth about them." Daphne watched him from the side pew. The distance between them was only a few yards, but it held every question she had not asked before that morning. Everett looked at Father Rowan. "Did you know this?" "I knew Margaret was trying to leave room for you to change," the priest said. "That is not the same as protecting you from consequences." Everett turned toward the family pew he had claimed as his right. The center seat remained empty beneath the white flowers. He could still sit there. No one had forbidden it. Yet the place now carried the weight of every absence money had disguised. He removed the council pin from his lapel, a small silver cross he had worn to meetings, ceremonies, and photographs, and placed it on the folded program. No gesture could undo what he had done, but for the first time, he stopped using his position as proof of his character. "I withdraw the conditions," he said. Miriam watched him carefully. "All of them. All of them." He looked toward the damaged ceiling. "The roof contribution will remain. The council can manage the repairs without my approval or my name." A quiet rustle moved through the pews. Father Rowan did not praise him. Noelle understood why. Doing the right thing after being exposed was not redemption. It was only the first honest step. Everett faced the congregation. His shoulders were no longer set for a speech. "I used my mother's service to control who could grieve her," he said. The words came slowly, each one costing him something he had once valued more than truth. "I treated a donation as authority. I told Noelle she did not belong because it was easier than admitting my mother trusted her when she could no longer trust me." He paused, but no one rescued him from the silence. "I was wrong." Then he turned toward Noelle. "I am sorry." She held his gaze. "I heard you." He waited, perhaps expecting more. Forgiveness. Relief. A restored image. Noelle offered none of them. Her calm response was not cruel. It simply refused to transform his apology into another transaction. Father Rowan stepped beside the aisle. "You may remain," he told Everett, "but not in the leadership pew today." He indicated an open seat near the back of the church. "If you wish to finish this service, sit there and listen." Everett looked toward the rear doors. For a moment, pride returned to his face. He could leave, withdraw from the room, and later describe the morning as an attack. The old path remained available. Daphne lowered her memorial program. Stay, she said quietly. Not because they need you to. Because you need to hear the rest. Everett looked at her, then at Noelle, then at the empty seat near the back. He walked down the aisle without ceremony. No one turned to follow him with their eyes. He sat alone beneath a narrow panel of blue-stained glass and unfolded Margaret's letter across his knees. Father Rowan returned to the altar. Jonah placed his hands on the organ keys. Before the closing hymn began, Noelle stepped toward Margaret's photograph and laid the first letter beside it. Everett watched from the back as she touched 2 fingers lightly to the frame, then returned to the seat Elaine had opened for her. The music rose through the church, gentle and unhurried. For the first time that morning, Everett did not occupy the center of the room, and for the first time in years, he did not try to reclaim it. The closing hymn ended on a quiet note that seemed to linger beneath the high ceiling after Jonah lifted his hands from the organ. No one rushed toward the doors. The congregation remained seated while Father Rowan offered a final remembrance of Margaret, not as a perfect woman, but as someone who had understood too late that silence could protect comfort while abandoning truth. Noelle listened without lowering her eyes. The morning had not restored what Everett had taken from her, and it had not erased the years when she had questioned whether dignity mattered if no one defended it. Yet as sunlight rested across the open seat beside her, she felt something loosen inside her. Margaret had spoken. The truth no longer depended on Noelle persuading anyone to believe it. When the service ended, people rose slowly. Elaine touched Noelle's hand before joining the line near Margaret's photograph. Miriam collected the blue folder but left the first letter beside the frame, exactly where Noelle had placed it. Daphne remained near the side pew, watching Everett at the back of the church. He had not moved. The council pin still lay at the front beside the program bearing his name. Without it, his suit looked no less expensive, but the authority he once wore so easily had become an empty space on his lapel. Noelle walked toward the altar one final time. She adjusted a white rose that had tilted beneath Margaret's photograph, then rested her fingers against the wooden frame. "You should have told him sooner," she whispered, not with anger, but with the tenderness reserved for people whose failures had not erased their love. "But you told him." Behind her, footsteps crossed the polished floor. Everett stopped several feet away. He held Margaret's letter carefully, no longer folded into a tight square. "I do not expect you to forgive me today," he said. Noelle turned. The sentence sounded different from his earlier apology because it asked for nothing. "Good," she replied. He accepted the answer with a small nod. "I told Miriam the donation will be transferred tomorrow. No conditions. No plaque. That is between you and the church." "I know." His eyes moved toward Margaret's photograph. "I kept thinking that if everything looked right, no one would notice what was missing." Noelle studied him. For years, she had imagined hearing him admit the truth. In those private fantasies, the moment had always felt triumphant. In reality, it felt quiet and unexpectedly sad. "You noticed," she said. "You simply believed absence was easier to manage than honesty." Everett looked down at the letter. "She wrote that I should apologize without asking you to make me feel better. Then listen to her." He nodded again. Daphne approached from the aisle, but she did not stand beside him. "I am going home alone," she said. Everett's expression tightened, though he did not argue. "We need to talk," he replied. "Yes," she said, "but not while you are trying to save the version of yourself you showed me." She walked toward the doors with her memorial program held against her chest. Everett watched her leave, then looked at Noelle. "Did I lose everything today?" Noelle glanced around the church. Volunteers were already discussing roof estimates with Miriam. Elaine was writing her phone number on a donation card. Jonah had begun collecting hymnals from the back pews. The building remained imperfect, but it no longer seemed dependent on one man's approval. "No," she said. "You lost the right to control what comes next." She picked up her purse and walked down the aisle. People made room for her without ceremony. No applause followed. No one needed to announce that she belonged. Near the doors, Father Rowan stood beside a table of white flowers. He offered her Margaret's worn leather Bible, the one that had rested on her nightstand during those final months. "She asked that you have this," he said. Noelle held it against her heart. Outside, the morning air was cool, and the church bells began to ring above the stone steps. Everett remained inside beneath the stained glass window, alone with his mother's letter and the first honest consequences of his choices. Noelle did not look back. She had not entered the church to win him back, defeat him, or reclaim a family name. She had come because a woman she loved had asked her to stand where the truth could finally reach the light. He had told her she did not belong, but belonging had never been his to give or take away.